Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session on digital rights landscape in the Asia Pacific region after COVID-19, and hopefully that time will be with us very, very soon. We have a very eminent panel with us: Malvika Jayaram from the Digital Asia Hub, Emilie Pradichit from the Manushya Foundation, and Udbhav Tiwari from the Mozilla Corporation. One second, okay. Somebody's admitting people in already. That's great. What we're going to talk about today is pretty simple. I think the title explains it, right? The outbreak of COVID-19 has had many unintended consequences. The one which has been most relevant for the panel here today and the audience here today is the fast tracking of the use of technology to solve problems which are not solved by technology inherently. We've seen public health interventions, public-private initiatives, as well as government responses primarily being based on the use of technology. These range right from contact tracing applications to digital health certificates and have been used in multiple methods, right from China, Singapore, South Korea to India and Australia, right? So what we're going to try and discuss with the panel today is to figure out what is the permanence of these ad hoc solutions that we've seen and what are the impacts on the rights of users. So let me just get into it and get Malvika in first to ask her what she has seen as the trajectory of the major digital rights issues that your institution has engaged with in the region right prior to the pandemic, and how has that sort of changed with the onset of COVID-19 and looking at the responses of governments and all other stakeholders in the region.
Yeah, thanks, Raman. Thanks for having me. Great to be here. I think for us, one very immediate change was that we're very convening heavy. We do a lot of in-person events, and that just died. So our whole mode of operation changed. Another was that some of the projects that we were just about to launch, looking at platforms and gamification and other kinds of ways in which social media makes things cute and attractive, and then like lures people in to do heavier surveillance. Some of those projects just seemed very pastel colored in a very dark world. You know, they just seemed frivolous. They seemed amusing and cute, and like they were speculative and interesting and really great formats, but it just seemed like the wrong mood and the wrong time to launch that. So we had to pivot away from that. Another thing that was very different was, I mean, the immediate impact of how, you know, the online offline connections and the way in which the digital rights landscape is very heavily informed by and informs work offline of people at the grassroots, people who do, you know, in-person protests and marches. That was an immediately shifting landscape that we noticed. Like, people were incredibly concerned about facial recognition. Facial recognition was, you know, the kind of thing you could protect yourself against using masks. Now, masks being mandatory was something that actually helped improve facial recognition, right? So I think those kinds of things, those are just like a few of the sort of immediate tangible changes, along with sort of a sense of self-censorship. A lot of people who meet and do things in person and who are very bold about what they do are suddenly thinking about their digital footprints. Even digital rights organizations have often done very sensitive things in ways that are not trackable. And now everybody, even like the most unsophisticated actors in this space, had to suddenly think about digital security, had to think about what apps to use, you know, what's being compromised, what isn't, how to avoid Zoom bombing, and eventually have to use a lot of the platforms that they'd spent a lot of time complaining about and critiquing, and trying to manage that sort of double speak. So I think that's just a very quick roundup for me.
Thank you, Malvika. And I think the impact that COVID-19 has had on not just our work, but on our organizations needs to be defined and needs to be discussed even more. But let me shift from to the original moderator of the conversation, who's Raman, Ramanjeet Singh Chima, my colleague. He's here. So I'll hand over to Raman to take this panel forward. Raman, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Raman. For those who are unfamiliar, I'm Raman Singh Chima. I'm Asia Pacific Policy Director and Senior International Counsel at Access Now. But less about me, more back to our fantastic panel. I'm going to pose the same question to Emilie. Emilie, as COVID-19 rolled in, what are the issues that you were dealing with previously, and how did the onset of COVID-19 and responses by governments and corporations to it impact the work that your organization, as well as the people you work with, how did it impact them? And Emilie, apologies, you're on mute.
Perfect. Thank you, Raman. Thank you, Raman. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. How was the digital rights trajectory before COVID-19 in our region? I'm going to focus more on Southeast Asia because this is where we are located and where we work the most. So before COVID-19, there was a clear rise of digital dictatorship in Southeast Asia, with the enactment of cyber laws being misused in the name of national security. And those laws have been passed for the past 5 years, but more recently, for the past 2 years, you have seen an increasing number of cyber laws that are not human-centered, that are not democratic, that do not involve the democratic participation of netizens and citizens to develop those laws, and which are not also grounded on human rights. So just to name a few, you have, for example, the Anti-Fake News Center, that has been developed in Thailand, but also the Cybersecurity Act of 2019, the increased number of use of the Computer Crime Act as well. In Laos, you have the cybercrime law that is being used. You also have Article 117 of the criminal law that is being used in the name of national security. You also have the Cyber Prevention Act in the Philippines. You also have POFMA in Singapore. These are examples of cyber laws that have been passed before COVID-19 and are being used to crack down on dissidents and really to control and monitor online freedom. How COVID-19 has impacted our work. Since COVID-19, Southeast Asian government have passed other laws. So they have most of them have passed emergency decrees and laws related to COVID-19 to respond to the emergency of the pandemic. However, to respond to the emergency of the pandemic, they passed emergency decrees that forbids us to talk about the government response, that forbid anyone to criticize the slow response from government. Also, we are not allowed to criticize the use of contact tracing apps. And as Malvika has said, we are also torn by using apps that we didn't want to use before, just like Line app. For example, in Thailand, we have to use the Line app to enter any space that we want to enter, because this is how the government is tracing us. This is how the government is keeping track on us. But more importantly, it's how COVID-19 has impacted the communities that we're working with. Same as Malvika, we cannot do face-to-face meetings, but when you are working with indigenous people and marginalized communities, you work face-to-face. You have to go on the ground and you have to meet them. So really, we are in a phase where most of our work now is being done online. Of course, some community members have received digital security trainings, but not all of them. And there's exacerbation of digital divides. So those who were already struggling to access internet when COVID-19 came, they were prioritizing buying food rather than prioritizing the use of internet. So we also lost contact with some indigenous communities, and now we are getting back to them, but we lost contact for a few months with some community members to whom we tried to send clothes, we tried to send soap, because these were the priorities for them rather than using the internet.
Thank you so much for that, Emilie. That's very helpful. And before, in fact, I move on to Udbhav, I also wanted to thank all the people who are very actively engaging in the chat room for this Zoom conversation. Please share, especially published resources on your experiences on the impact of COVID-19 and future going work as well, because this is exactly sort of resources and collaboration we wish to promote. And with that, I was going to go to Udbhav. And Udbhav, you heard a bit from Emilie about not just the issue-based consequences, but as she and Malvika flagged, also the challenges of engaging with the stakeholders they normally work with, whether it's grassroots activists or academics and policy actors across the region. And I was curious for you in your work which straddles both public interest technology as well as product development and advice for a tech corporation, what sort of experience, what are issues going prior to COVID and how did COVID impact that, at least for you regionally?
Thanks, Raman. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending the panel. I think that there are two questions there, right? The first is on, and I'll take the sort of product one first, because I think that's both more unique for the group, and we had some very interesting experiences where I think there would like two main developments, right? Like the first is one of the main things that you do as a product policy individual is you very often serve as an interface between all other stakeholders and internal product development teams. So whether it's civil society members, whether it's members of government, you sort of to help them inform and make better products and respond to market needs. And COVID definitely completely switched that around where traditionally the time when COVID kicked in, which is about like let's just say mid-late Jan, is when most people have come back from their holidays and like everyone essentially begins to implement the plan for the year. And pretty much for the next 3 to 4 months, like right after that, very similar to I think almost every other field, most of the plans that everyone already had made completely went for toss, right? And some of those impacts I think have stayed for much longer since then. And a good example of that I think is government engagement, right? Like so, as a part of the Mozilla Corporation, whether it's for laws and policies or whether it's questions on product, we interface quite regularly with members of governments both in the region and elsewhere in the world, both in order to respond to regulatory queries, but also in order to like sort of help proactively push an agenda where we believe that the internet should remain a global, public and accessible resource. So in almost all of those instances, like those government meetings have almost come to a standstill. When they do happen virtually, government stakeholders are incredibly uncomfortable having these meetings on digital like platforms, because of like the sort of far more obvious risks of either where there are trust issues of essentially can they believe that that conversation is as private as a conversation in their offices would be, and secondly also because it's literally the use and the use and pervasiveness with which even us as a sector utilize technology is not as close, is not as sort of deep in many sort of like government offices all over the world, even within sort of IT departments. So on the product front, I think apart from the change of plans and becoming harder to talk to government, like it's also been quite radically like within Mozilla, many like sort of like for example, I think a good example to give, and this is something that can publicly be verified. Like I think the prioritization, for example, that Mozilla gave internally to fixing bugs on video like chatting platforms to make sure that all of them work as consistently as possible on Firefox, where sometimes there were bugs that weren't really very highly prioritized for a year or two, becoming super prioritized also took place. So there was also very much a sense within the organization responding to the need and making sure that users can continue to sort of live their lives and perform as many of the activities as they can online as well. So those, I think, were some of the highlights.
Thank you so much for that, Udbhav. And that's what brings me to my next question. So I know we've talked a little bit about what we were seeing before, and we still, I think a lot of us are processing what all is happening, whether it's within our country, region, or within private or other actors across this region in terms of the impact of COVID-19. But I was curious on that, what do you think is going to stick? Like, what are the changes brought on by COVID or the acceleration of trends brought on by COVID-19 for the Asia Pacific region in particular that you think is going to stay with us beyond 2021? Again, being reasonably optimistic and hoping that there's a significant change in treatment of the pandemic, and while it may stay with us for an overall while, at least that the peak pandemic period may end in 2021. But what of the digital rights developments that have happened during this period or trends do you think will stay beyond that? And I'll go back to the top. I'll start with Malvika. Malvika, I thought I'd ask you that question first.
I think for me personally, the most immediate change I'm going to prophesize about is about the impact on students and education and young people, because I'm also a professor, and the sort of education industrial complex is literally like on steroids. We've always had trust issues with students, as if like preventing cheating is sort of the only thing we care about in education. And I think now online, the sort of proctoring tools and the sort of shifting lines of what is acceptable in terms of surveillance, like literally, like if you blink your eyelids, you're deemed to have cheated, like you're looking at materials you're not supposed to. So I think the sort of four corners of our screen are sort of preventing mobility in all kinds of ways. And I think that's meant to stay. I think as they find that it's cheaper to hire people to do online classes and virtual lessons, and it's easier to actually map and track learning. I mean, and this is not to say that there are not excellent reasons why that might actually be inclusive, right? For people who otherwise find it difficult, to have learning disabilities. There are many reasons why online learning might actually draw in people who otherwise might be prevented from accessing education. but it does presume that they have a functional laptop, or internet connection, the money to pay for data plans, the sort of knowledge to actually go virtual. So I think the surveillance implications of it actually might, in a lot of instances, outweigh the inclusive aspects that come out of this. I think the other huge change is on labor and sort of gig economy kind of issues, right? In terms of the people who they're now being clapped for as heroes and frontline workers, the people who bring you food and all of this, people who are shopping and picking things in warehouses, all the sort of Amazon workers. But they're the ones who also have no healthcare, no benefits, and the people who actually can't afford to ring in and say, I'm not turning up for work. And who are the ones who have to mandatorily use things like contact tracing and immunity passports and technologies that otherwise might be opt-in and voluntary for other people, right? So I think the impact of a lot of the technology sort of spread because of COVID, I think has extremely disproportionate impact on the poor, on minorities, on, you know, certain kinds of racial demographics, even things like, you know, facial recognition might actually have disproportionate effects on people who aren't recognized when they try to unlock platforms because their skin is too dark. A lot of other reasons, right? Like you try and upload pictures, it says that for verification that you're doing your exam, and it says, oh, the subject's eyes are closed when the subject just happens to be Asian, right? So I think those are a lot of implications where technology that was developed pre-COVID, that's now being ported into contexts that are post-COVID, without actually thinking about the design challenges, about the data sets on which machine learning algorithms were trained. Things like profiling, things like predictive technologies, who's likely to cheat, who's likely to commit a crime. I think those kinds of issues are going to become really, really problematic. And I think with a lot of technology that happens in times of disaster or crisis, or even happy events like a FIFA World Cup, right? You might have facial recognition, Robocop kind of glasses to do crowd control of football hooligans. But that's an instance, it's a blip, it happens and it's gone. And then we know from those instances that those technologies of CCTV cameras and Robocop glasses are never dismantled after the event has ceased. And there's no reason to expect that in a context like COVID, where you have peaks and troughs and waves, where it's not a disease that's over and there's no finite end date, it's a really great excuse to just make ubiquitous surveillance also something that has no temporal end date. So I think those are some of the issues that I'm particularly concerned about that you have. And I mean, I live in Singapore now where, we were improving, we were the gold standard for a lot of things. And then, oops, we suddenly remember there's a whole bunch of migrant laborers who live in dorms that we just kind of forgot to look out for. So I think those kinds of cleavages along income lines, around labor categories, I think that's going to get even starker, and you're going to be able to buy yourself out of a lot of situations. You can go to a mall if you can, sign in for a QR code. But if you're a migrant labor, you're going to be locked into like a 6-by-4 room with 6 other people. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Malvika. And I know some of those issues may be common, but I pose the question. Emilie, what do you think for your work and for the people you engage with, what are the developments or trends we're seeing that are likely to stick or stay with us beyond 2021?
Thank you, Raman. According to us, there are 3 key points that I would like to touch on for developments that will stay with us beyond 2021. The first one is related to our right to privacy and data protection issues. The second one is the digital dictatorship that has been exacerbated in Southeast Asia. And the third point is, of course, the exacerbation of digital divides. So regarding the first point, since COVID-19, there has been a use of emergency laws to restrict and sharing opinions of COVID-19 response or any situation in Southeast Asian countries. And there has also been internet shutdowns in specific countries, which equals to a barrier of accessing information related to health risk. So when it comes to data protection, in Southeast Asia, most of the countries, we don't have data protection laws. There are data protection laws in Indonesia and Thailand, but these are not being implemented or enacted. There is one in Singapore, but the data protection law in Singapore is very problematic as it does not hold the government accountable for data protection violations. So, and the Thai and Indonesian data protection laws are modeled on the Singaporean one. So it's very problematic for us because with the use of contact tracing apps, we are leaving our digital footprints and we are providing a lot of data to governments for them to respond to COVID-19. However, we don't know what is going to happen with our data since we don't have any data protection laws in Southeast Asia. And it's very problematic because you see most of the committees that we're working with, everybody is providing data. Everybody is providing the information to government, thinking that government are doing the right thing to protect us from the spread of COVID-19. What is very also hypocrite in Southeast Asia and especially in Thailand is that the country is being praised for being a global leader in mitigating the spread of COVID-19, but at the same time, we are still under an emergency decree. So we don't understand the state of emergency. We don't understand why in many Southeast Asian countries, we are under state of emergency when we are being praised for being global leaders in the way that we are mitigating the spread of COVID-19. There's no need to have emergency decree laws. And just in Thailand, for example, the emergency decree has been extended until the end of October just yesterday. And we don't know why, because there are no new cases. We are not a dangerous country when it comes to the pandemic. So really, there's a real concern with how our data is going to be used now that data is being provided to governments in response to COVID-19, since we don't have data protection laws. The other one is, of course, the other issue is, of course, the exacerbation of digital dictatorship. As I was explaining, it was already an issue before COVID-19. It became even worse with COVID-19. With COVID-19, you have Southeast Asian governments turning democracy into mediocrities. They are using state of emergency decrees to crack down on dissidents. If you look, for example, in Laos, you have the Prime Minister order. In Thailand, you have the emergency decree. In the Philippines, you have the Bahan di Bahan to Heal as One Act. In the Singapore, you have the circuit breaker measures. In Malaysia, you have the movement control order. I mean, all Southeast Asian countries have passed emergency decree laws. In Cambodia, they have developed the law, but it's the only Southeast Asian country that is not implementing the emergency decree. However, it doesn't stop governments to use other laws and those laws to crack down on dissidents. So those emergency decree laws were supposed to be in place to protect us from COVID-19. But what we are seeing is that those laws are being used to crack down on anyone who is criticizing the slow response from governments or the mismanagement of COVID-19 from governments. And the third point, of course, is the digital divide that has been exacerbated. We have been, before COVID-19, we were able to work with communities and provide them with digital security trainings, but not all communities were able to access those trainings. With COVID-19, there are a lot of communities that are not prioritizing internet at all, and are not even prioritizing the security on internet at all. Because the second they can access internet, they will go to McDonald's, they will go to Starbucks, they will go give all their data to access free Wi-Fi. So you see, we cannot stop also our community members and our partners from going to malls, from going to places where they will receive free Wi-Fi, knowing that they will have to provide the data. We cannot refrain them from doing that. That's the only way they can access internet nowadays because of the situation and because they will not increase the financial expenses on internet. They will use it for other priorities. So really, this is all. Sometimes we feel that all the work that we have been doing on digital security is being destroyed by the pandemic because we cannot stop people from accessing free Wi-Fi and from giving away the data.
Thank you so much for that, Emilie. And what I thought I just, before Udbhav goes, just mentioned the tapestry that we have in a sense. It's a troubling tapestry, but it's one of the cementing of surveillance by not just government actors, but even by private actors, even in the education space, people who sometimes should know better, but just saying this is the new normal and we want to use it everywhere as we engage with people remotely. We see the failure of data protection and surveillance oversight mechanisms in this region. I'm sure others may have views on that, but like a failure for them to really either grow or police, especially government action. We see, in fact, the state action by lots of Southeast Asian governments being used to cement further emergency powers, their own powers to criticize, or rather to criminalize people who criticize them for their responses to COVID-19. So ironically, the abuse that takes place can't be articulated. And also both the digital divide, but also digital security gaps growing during this period. People being made more vulnerable and more at risk. And this is sort of tapestry of things that you all, at least right now, Malvika and you, Emilie, have indicated you think may continue beyond 2021. And so, Udbhav, what do you think? What what do you think may continue with, not just of some of these elements, perhaps even other things beyond 2021 in terms of how COVID-19 has impacted the track of digital and the trend of digital in the region?
Thanks, Raman. I think I have two responses. The first is I think a more positive one, and the second I think focuses on the negative aspect. On the positive front, I do think that the pandemic has helped make many of the issues that have been very important in our sector mainstream. Right, for just as an example, access and connectivity. Right, as an issue, it's something that many people care about, but many governments in the region have largely left to market forces per se to sort of percolate it down to regions where it's not already available, right? And even in regions where it's available, things like speed and reliability are sort of almost afterthoughts. But because of the challenges that the pandemic has forced the populations in these regions to deal with, I think governments and, more importantly, mainstream press and sort of public discourse and conversation have definitely made them issues that not only many people are talking about, and often on very similar terms and ideologies that folks who've been working on it for decades speak about, but also are now starting to get more and more invested about. And I think that that's going to be a trend that is going to stay, largely because I think, like it has already been discussed, many of the sort of ways the world has morphed and changed because of, I think, COVID are also going to sort of last after it changing, right? I think on the education front and the workplace, people have already discussed why that will take place. And on the sort of I think negative front and on the drawback, I definitely think that this broader sort of almost neo-tech solutionism that exists right now, and is probably at its peak, at its peak globally from since I think the advent of technology, that says that let's try to use technologies to fix problems that have been posed by the pandemic or exist in the virtual world, I think is definitely going to stay. And the problem with that tech solutionism is multifold, right? I think that many of the points here that were already mentioned, I think point to how governments are utilizing technology, but I think there's also the question of governance and oversight, right? And I think Emilie's point of the emergency decrees definitely points towards that broader trend where when new laws and regulations have to be passed that make in order for governments to be able to do things, a lot of the checks and balances that would traditionally exist simply don't anymore. And conversations around those checks and balances can be sort of almost one side can be overridden by saying, hey, this is about the pandemic, or hey, this is about technology and we all really need technology. I have a feeling that's a trend that's definitely going to stick on after the pandemic. And I think that because I think that the importance and need for technology will be as important in the recovery of the world economy and of individual economies as it is in its current operation and functioning. But B, also because I think governments will realize that they can get away with a lot of stuff that notionally was much harder to get away with before that. And a lot of the sort of and I'm going to come to this a little later, but a lot of the sort of coordination and how the digital rights sector broadly has been impacted, I think it will take much longer for it to recover than I think many other sectors will. And because of that, the amount of resources that could be deployed in order to push back against problematic legislation, ensure that things happen in a process with sufficient due process, is just going to become much harder as time goes by. And it's something that we definitely have to fight for.
Thank you for that, Udbhav. And in fact, you also set us up, I think, well for next part of the conversation. And what I thought I'd also do is, we had one, of course, absolutely final question, and maybe we can take that after a bit of Q&A. But what I thought I'd just pose here is on that, both the negative as well as positive front, right? And the negative is rather more a question that I'd pose to you, Malvika, and to you, Emilie. On the digital rights front, do you think that the space for digital rights in the Asia-Pacific region has shrunk, or has it remained the same, or what space are we at on that right now? And I know it's a slightly hard question, but I was genuinely curious because, taking what Udbhav mentioned, it's possible that it's just the same. Maybe some things have become harder, some things have remained the same, or has it actually shrunk? And I know this can really vary from country to country, East Asia versus Southeast Asia versus South Asia. But I thought I'd try and take your thoughts on that and then come a bit to, what are the positive examples of collaboration later? Any of you would like to go? Malvika, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. I think it's pivoted and shifted. I don't know that it's shrunk. As you said, it might have shrunk in some spaces and enlarged in others. I think I've always said that the road to hell is paved with balancing metaphors. And I think those have like literally gone to the sort of imbalanced end of the spectrum. Like the amount of like, to even sound like a sane person in this space, you have to sort of keep bringing up the positive elements. Otherwise, people think you're a raving lunatic right now, because everyone is so okay with the idea that norms have shifted and that there are certain kinds of surveillance that are okay in the collective interest, and that privacy being breached is okay. And it's some crazy individualistic, enlightenment construct that really doesn't work when you're working with disasters and pandemics. So I think in some ways it is shrinking because it's undoing a lot of the work that's taken years to actually build up, and is being replaced with this fetishization of technology and this sort of innovation, right? Like, oh, Asians are so good at innovating, we're already mobile first, let's kill cash entirely, right? Or let's use like facial recognition to like validate everything. And it's instead of actually saying that, there are spaces where technology has been used in egregious ways minus the legal safeguards, right? In a sort of policy vacuum, like Emilie was saying, many countries don't have data protection laws or other kinds of mechanisms that will check against rampant use of these things. Instead, we're sort of seeing Asia as a poster child for a lot of these technologies being trialed, being beta tested on people who don't have the ability to say they don't consent, and then being exported elsewhere. So I think that kind of trickle-down effect from richer countries to poorer countries, from countries that are sort of first in coming up with these tools, I think that's shrinking certain spaces. Biometrics, we've been like protesting for so many years. We've been trying to do so much work on this. And now suddenly everything is about biometrics, and that's okay. I think the third area where I'm finding it quite hard is often when we've had to make cases to sort of influence policy and, sort of bring a measured, data-driven, evidence-driven approach to issues, often the use cases, the sort of data is from somewhere else, right? You're sitting in Myanmar or sitting in Nepal and raising data about, the impact of sort of fiber in communities in Colombia or in Chicago. That to me is something that I'm really worried that the ability to do field work and to do empirical data in the region and to actually collaborate to get information from primary sources, I feel that's something that's shrinking in many ways. The collaborations we could have had, the field work we could have done, I think that's going to fundamentally shift. But I think the other good thing is that we don't have to have visas anymore to go to events and to speak about these things. I mean, the number of times I've been on panels where the poor person from Pakistan couldn't show up because they didn't get their visa in time, I feel in a way like the world has suddenly enlarged for a lot of people who neither had the funds nor the visa, were just born under the wrong passport or country. I feel that kind of opening up of spaces that were otherwise close to them, I think that's a really positive thing, and we should really piggyback on that. I know people are like burnt out from Zoom fatigue, but I think the flip side of that is we have access to people we could never have dreamt of meeting or talking to or bringing into webinars or podcasts. I think a lot of people are willing to engage if they don't have to jump on a plane, willing to engage for the right cause, willing to do more than just sign a petition. And I think that's, sort of being able to leverage that moment where people say, look, I can't be somewhere, but if you need me to speak for 5 minutes about my experience, I'm happy to do that. I'll record a 5-minute video so it's asynchronous. And I think this is sort of not really a digital rights issue, but maybe it is. We've had a lot of time zone paternalism in the past where, we've all had to function according to somebody else's time zone and nobody really cares about the ones who are on the other side of the world. I think now that everybody's working from home, I think the rest of the world is now understanding how difficult it is to do our jobs and how people are unfairly affected and how people with childcare responsibilities are doing their work and doing that. So I think it's sort of making people a little more empathetic, and I think that's a good thing. The only thing I worry about is the diversion of a lot of funds towards COVID-related activities where people who are probably not expert in some of these issues suddenly have to package up their work as, oh, this is really relevant for COVID because otherwise they won't get the grant. And I worry about things that are not yet solved. We haven't solved privacy. We haven't solved access. We haven't solved divides. But yet all of that has to be seen through a healthcare lens or a bioethics lens for it to be valid, because everybody is shifting priorities. And I think that's a real shame, because gender-based violence, other kinds of issues that are being exacerbated, are not necessarily getting the same level of attention.
Thank you so much for that, Malvika. And Emilie, same the question to you in terms of, as the space shrunk, are there other opportunities or takeaways for digital rights in the broader region or even just Southeast Asia?
Thank you, Raman. So again, I'm going to speak about Southeast Asia. In our region, obviously, the digital space has been restricted. Since COVID-19, it has definitely shrunk. As I was explaining before, the enactment of emergency decrees and national security laws in the name of COVID-19 has definitely worsened the digital rights landscape in Southeast Asia. So I'm going to give you some specific example of how governments in Southeast Asia have been using those laws against anyone criticizing the response to COVID-19. So, for example, in Cambodia, although there's no emergency decree, the government is using the telecommunication law or defamation to arrest more than 40 people who have been criticizing the way that the government has responding to COVID-19, including a 14-year-old girl who just spoke about being scared that 3 of her classmates were COVID-19 positive. Just because she shared that on social media, she was arrested. In Laos, also, there has been an increased number of arrests due to COVID-19. The government has been using the Prime Minister order related to COVID-19 to arrest a 25-year-old woman who was sharing on Facebook that she saw COVID-19 positive people at the Vientiane Mall, the capital of Laos, instead of being put in quarantine. They also caught a 27-year-old migrant worker from Thailand who was put in quarantine, who was not provided with information and who was not informed about his rights. So he did a Facebook Live and criticized the way that he was treated by the Lao government and the poor health conditions that he was put in. He was put in jail. And more recently, on 26 August, another Lao person was arrested, Sang Han. He was arrested because he was denouncing corruption going on in the country, although there is COVID-19. He was just wondering why the government is still being corrupt when they should focus on mitigating the response to COVID-19. He was arrested. In Thailand, you have a mix of arrest and the COVID-19 for people criticizing the government. So you have the Thai artist Dana Yusama, who came back from Spain, who criticized the way that the government was responding to COVID-19 at the airport. On Facebook, he was arrested. You also have the administrator of an investigative Facebook page, Queen of Spades, who is right now under investigation because she was talking about corruption and a mass hoarding scandal, which involved politicians from the military-backed political party. She's now under investigation. You also have the issue of racial discrimination and racial profiling in South Thailand, where you have the Muslim minority that is forced to provide the data. So you have collection of biometric data and registration of SIM cards. And if they did not provide the data, their phone would have been disconnected since April 2020. So there's a real targeting of Muslim minority, and it's racial discrimination force. And you also have tech companies that are being forced to take down content that the government is not happy with. For example, when it's about the monarchy. And so the Thai government just recently on 24th September has taken legal action by filing police complaints against Facebook and Twitter because they refuse to follow the government order. Then in Myanmar, you have arrest of activists, but you also have internet shutdown. That is a real issue. As you know, the Section 77 of the telecommunication law allows for internet shutdown, and there has been internet shutdown for more than a year in Rakhine and Shan states. The impact is that people don't have access to information related to COVID-19, and when the activist poet Mang Songkha was denouncing the internet shutdown and the fact that communities were not able to access information related to COVID, he was arrested in June because he was protesting against the internet shutdown. In March 2020, the government also ordered the shutdown of more than 2,000 websites, saying that it was to avoid misinformation around COVID-19. However, when you look at the sites that have been shut down, you can see that there's the Karen News, you have the Voice of Myanmar, you have websites that are talking about human rights issues and Rohingya population that have been taken down. And just to finish, in Indonesia, you have activists that are being arrested when they were criticizing the slow response of COVID, but also they have also been victims of cyber attacks. So you have more than 50 activists that have been victims of cyber attacks by the government and by trollers of the government because they're denouncing internet shutdown and the way that governments are responding to COVID-19. Finally, I just want to end on how it has negatively impacted our digital rights in Southeast Asia. So, for example, in the case where you have hate speech going on online against marginalized communities, be it migrant workers in Singapore or in Malaysia during the COVID-19 pandemic, the private sector has shown very slow response to take down harmful content, and sometimes they did not even bother applying the content moderation policies. So you still have hate speech going on online against migrant workers in Singapore, in Malaysia, claiming that they are bringing the COVID-19 to the country. So also there was like a slow response from the private sector during the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Emilie. As I said, that's a useful, show but not tell approach of being able to show what all has been happening here and letting people determine where the space is shrinking. And with that, I wanted to be able for us to address some of the questions that have come up. And so this is now the Q&A period. I'm going to also try and ensure that we have 5 minutes in the end to be able to wrap up. There have been a bunch of questions posed in chat already, and I'm going to try and address them. I've culled some of them out. And then anyone else who wishes to ask other questions, preferably not those who already asked questions in chat, please use the Zoom functionality to raise your hand, and we'll try and do our best based on how the algorithm stacks you and how we have time. But first, for those who are prepared and asked textual questions, I thought I'll go to them first. There are a couple of questions that are very specific. We can do those in chat. One to you, Malvika, which I'll send across to you again on chat. And there's a broader question on Iran and sanctions that I'll try and again address on chat because it might be off topic to the panelists here. But in terms of the more directly on topic questions, there's a useful one here. Don't you think there has been an increase in awareness on data privacy issues as a result of the pandemic, especially because of contact tracing apps and the issues they have brought up? That being the case, how can we leverage that for better policy responses regards to data protection and privacy? Is there any of you that would like to start? And I may put Udbhav on the spot because I saw him nod a little bit. So how do we leverage the increased interest in privacy issues because of contact tracing to perhaps improve privacy more generally?
Thanks, Raman. I think the quick response is very similar to access. Privacy definitely has become a little more of a mainstream issue than what it was before in many countries in the region. And I think that the best way for us to leverage that is to actually use that increased awareness to feed back into the digital rights movement, right? So far, barring I think very few examples like net neutrality in India, most sort of digital right issues haven't really been mass people movements. They while people may have been aware of say issues with the Aadhaar, India's digital identity project, very, very few people actually participated in measures to either boycott it or push back against the way in which it was being made mandatory throughout the country. And I think that that sheer quantum of people really does help. In making sure that the worst things don't happen. And I think that there is some evidence of that in India. I think the widespread outcry that was coordinated reasonably well by civil society in India was responsible for the minimal concessions that were made to India's contact tracing app Arogya Setu not being made mandatory, right? And the fact that some of its code, as poorly as it was and is now definitely outdated, being open sourced, and the fact that the government had committed to it being open sourced, sort of being used as a stick to continuously hold them accountable to the fact that they haven't done so. And I think both of them happened because they became public issues and not just because of the role of civil society. So, to answer the second part of the question, which is what can be done to leverage that better, I think it's really important for civil society organizations and advocacy organizations to evolve. I think doing virtual and online advocacy in and of itself is definitely quite a new paradigm, and it's important that as we go about doing so, we try to leverage both strategically as well as on a more sort of principle level, identifying moments in time when it is the most effective to make an issue come to the fore, and then having a targeted change that you push through at that moment. And I think coordinating between agents, between organizations both in the region as well as within countries, and learning from other movements that I think have done a far better job of advocacy than the digital rights movement has in many countries in the region, I think are the two best ways to do so.
Anyone else on that point? Quickly, otherwise I can take the next question. I will move us to the next question then, which is that, and perhaps Emilie, this might be well placed for you, and I know Malvika may also have thoughts, which is how do we stop digital authoritarianism in Asia Pacific? Apologies, I always stumble over that. While governments tend to promote state-sponsored surveillance and internet shutdowns, and particularly given that countries such as China don't don't stop the supply of these technologies. So given that, development as well as a concern sometimes of the lack of regulation or surveillance tech coming from Chinese companies and others, what can we do to stop this accelerating authoritarian trend?
Thank you, Raman. Thank you for this excellent question, because that's a question that we always ask ourselves and that we try to respond with other civil society groups in the region. I think that in order to respond to digital dictatorship, we have seen also a rise of positive development and collaboration among civil society and among other actors in the region. For example, we have seen online, I'm sure everybody has been seeing it on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, but we have seen mutual support and resistance among civil society and student activists online, all using the hashtag Milk Tea Alliance, all showing solidarity to pro-democracy activists and online freedom activists in the region. Also, we have also in our region what we're also doing with other activists from Cambodia, from Indonesia, Myanmar, the Philippines, and Malaysia and Singapore, is that we are trying to build a campaign, and that's something that we are going to launch next month, and it's building on the RightsCon session that we had during RightsCon, which was focusing on national security in the digital space in Southeast Asia. So we realized that before COVID-19 and because of COVID-19, there's a real need for us to resist. There's a real need for us to have a strong voice and coming as one strong voice from the region to push back on digital dictatorship. We were all working in isolation back in our countries, trying to denounce digital authoritarianism. But then we realized if we all come together and we have a common agenda at the regional level, we will be able to make more noise. So what we are trying to do is that we are trying to develop a hashtag Stop Digital Dictatorship. As our friend from Mozilla was saying, most of our advocacy now is happening online. So that's why we also need to use social media platform to get our voices out. We are trying to reach out to young people, get them engaged in our Stop Digital Dictatorship campaign. But as I said, it will be launched in October, and it's about coalition building. So we are 6 members for now. And what we are trying to do is that once we're going to launch the campaign, it's actually already available on our website. But what we're going to do is we are trying to reach out to many more people in the region for them to join our campaign, for them to have their voices heard, and to really advocate on 5 key points. So we have 5 key points that really we think are the obstacle to digital rights and are the illustration of digital dictatorship in our region. First, we want to see a decriminalization of defamation that is being wrongly used in our region to criminalize critics. We also want to see countries to adopt human-centered and human rights-grounded policies in line with international human rights standards for data protection and right to privacy. We also want to see a stop of harassment against activists and human rights defenders who are basically just sharing the concern, and they shouldn't be arrested or threatened. We also want to see an end of internet shutdown, and we want to see a restoration of democracy. So what we also want to do is also to urge tech companies to do like what Facebook is doing right now in Thailand, is that when tech companies are forced to remove content, we want them to resist as we are resisting. We want them to push back on governments, and we want them to commit to implement the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and to remind governments that they have international human rights obligations under ICCPR. So I think the only solution we have right now, because of COVID and because that we're all working online, it's to join forces, is to resist online, is to make noise, is to come join forces as one strong voice, and also to encourage and urge tech companies to also join our hands and push back on governments when they are asking to remove content.
Thank you, Emilie. I'm going to go to the one person who is right now in queue to ask an oral question. So Yik Chan Chin, if you could unmute, please. I've asked you to unmute and ask your question in 30 seconds, and then we'll do a wrap up from our panelists as well.
Sorry, it's for me to ask a question? Sorry?
Yes, please go ahead. You raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. I would like to ask a question about the impact of the pandemics and the boundary between the private interest and the public interest, because we saw some litigations in both America and the UK regarding to whether people should have a choice, to take on certain requests from the government, for example, like wearing masks or use the apps, data tracing apps. So I'm just wondering how this pandemic actually, shift the boundary between the public interest and the personal right. Thank you.
I think that's a good place for us to also close in terms of thinking about next steps? And I know that's been part of this tension, right? What sort of acceptable bounds can governments cross? And I know maybe I'll put that to you, Malvika, and ask for you to wrap up as well. You flagged that we may be erring too much on this. There are long-term consequences of accepting this willingness to let government intrude upon our private space. What final wrap-up thoughts do you have people consider?
Yeah, I think very quickly, and I think this builds on what Edmund wrote in the chat as well, which is that I think we used to have this false binary, which we've been talking about for years, about to use tech or not use tech. I think now we're beginning to see the shades of gray in between that binary choice and saying, you can use tech, you can do contact tracing, but could you use a privacy preserving or privacy enhancing technique? So you could use DP3T, you could use a different way of actually approaching the same problem. You could have data stored on someone's phone and not centrally in the cloud. So I think that conversation, which was a very esoteric technical conversation, which was a very you're a tinfoil hat wearing Faraday cage crazy person, I think that's become immensely mainstream right now. Right. So I think that, using those kinds of techniques to say, yes, we see that there is a balancing thing to do here. And we're not saying like we can't have it, but to actually elevate the things that are actually more invasive, the extent to which they really don't work and they're not effective, they don't change anything, and to actually sort of enhance how a lot of the outsourcing to tech actually fails. Whereas if tech is used in very strategic ways with human oversight, human in the loop, human over the loop, whatever particular model you want to use, and use it to flag things, but have the human very involved, I think that kind of way to eliminate bias is also super useful. I also think it's forcing us to rethink what it means to boycott and resist, right? What does digital rights activism look like? Like, how do you boycott an app if you're effectively being asked to boycott a country, right? Is trying to push against certain types of tech effectively making you more, I hate the word populist when you mean racist or fascist, so I won't use populist. But I think those kinds of echo chambers that are being fueled through misinformation, I think it's a really great chance for us to really think about how we can be thoughtful about this, how we can use strategic litigation to actually get information from authorities about algorithms, about assumptions, about black boxes, given that they're now affecting the entire population rather than only a few marginalized people. And I think to the effect that we can actually piggyback on the fact that this is, as they keep saying in policy speak, right, the virus doesn't discriminate. Well, actually, the effects do discriminate. But if you're saying it doesn't discriminate, why can't we have a mainstream conversation about technology where it's useful and where it's harmful, and actually like push the agenda? And they're always saying never waste a crisis. Let's use it to push through all these hideous emergency laws. I think we should be doing the same. Academia, civil society should be doing the same. Don't waste the crisis. Use it as levers to actually push agendas that nobody was interested in before. But now if you link it to the pandemic, suddenly people care about, anonymous learning, about privacy in certain spaces, spatial privacy, your right to exist in a city. So I think like we should be using those and sort of using them as wedge issues. And more than anything, I think self-care, mental health, and don't lose hope, which is really hard when everything's miserable.
Very, very important. Even though we have had a countdown, doomsday clock warning us that we're out of time. Thought I'd just give 10 seconds. Anything else on the point of hope or issues to keep in mind, Udbhav or Emilie? We're all good. So with that, this is an important one. Don't lose hope, but also stay in touch. This community is a fantastic one. All these people are based in the region. I'll be happy to forward and put them in touch with you. Naman and my contact details are there in the chat box. They also are all on Twitter, so please follow their work. All their respective organizations and initiatives do great work. And with that, I just wanted to again thank you for following this session. Please follow more of the sessions at the remainder of Asia Pacific IGF. And of course, for any work about Access Now, please visit our website and please let us know how we can be of help. Thank you so much. And it's been fantastic. And we hope this session has been of use and interest to you. Take care, everyone.
And thanks, Raman, for moderating and bringing us all together.
Thank you, APrIGF team. Bye.Asia team.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Please remember to reflect the really good conversation into the APrIGF